Hello, and thank you for joining me. I present this lecture as an apprentice and as an academic, and I would like to start by offering my utmost respect and appreciation for the ancestors, descendants, and practitioners of traditional Austronesian and oceanic seafaring as I describe it here. Stemming from the Austronesian cultures that developed in the Southeast Asian archipelago of Nusantara, seafaring migrations stretched across the Pacific and Indian Oceans to settle locations as far as Easter Island in the west, Hawaii to the north, New Zealand to the south, and Madagascar to the east. The islands that occupy this vast territory of the globe share a history that can be seen in a variety of material connections and customs, from language and pottery to a rich seafaring tradition that manifests itself in similar and unique ways depending on location. Along this network, there exists a heritage and formal pedagogy pertaining to material harvest, vessel construction, and open sea navigation. Each of these largely island spaces are connected physically through historical traces of movement that are ancient and contemporary forms of communication and knowledge. Such knowledge bases and forms of communication speak volumes and are very symbolic and can be seen in the hukalea as forms of performance inquiry and native agency. The hukalea famously sails from Hawaii to Tahiti and back via only traditional means of Austronesian and oceanic seafaring practices. The lesser known Borobudur does something similar and communicates a shared traditional seafaring past, sailing from Indonesia to Madagascar in the entirely different direction. Both of these performances are illustrations of native agency, indigenous knowledge, and embodied forms of inquiry that function symbolically as well as physically. In this presentation, I view this culture as a way of knowing based on performance practices that are akin to speech acts, in that they communicate messages publicly to real and perceived audiences. In some form or another, and in numerous locations, traditional seafaring practices continue as they have been for thousands of years, despite historical and colonization. Because of national, religious, and colonial legacies of division and cultural destruction, the maintaining of these forms of communication today are also forms of social advocacy. In order to discuss seafaring as a form of communication, I examine it not as a singular endeavor, but as a structural network that functions much like a linguistic system, where each symbol in a linguistic system is connected to all others. And to remove one particular symbol is to misunderstand the nature of how that symbol functions in relation to all of the others. And so I've broken seafaring practices down into these elements: individual, community, space, practices, objects, and pedagogy. And I'll describe them here and note how they function concurrently. My intention is rhetorical, in that I'm not necessarily describing traditional seafaring practices, although that will happen, but more so I'm emphasizing how they function as symbolic acts of communication. Post-structuralists and French theorists Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari have a notion of a rhizomatic structure. And I borrow this conceptual structure to note that seafaring networks function much like a series of plateaus or crabgrass that rises up and levels off while remaining attached via an underground network. And while we can witness an individual blade of grass or a plateau, these biological instances remain connected via an underground network that oftentimes goes unseen. And so while we can see large acts of symbolic communication in open sea voyaging, and we can celebrate individual navigators, and rightly so, we should also pay attention to the network that sustains these acts of communication. And without the network, we will cease to have these beautiful and grand symbolic acts. The rhizomatic network of traditional seafaring I engage in and observe, from participating in ceremonies, learning rituals, sailing and building traditional and hybrid canoes, harvesting and identifying plants, all the way to maintaining social and physical spaces, might appear to be separate activities, but they remain connected. Traditional seafaring culture relies on a larger cultural network that constitutes a paradigmatic approach to space, knowledge, and travel, which in many ways is transnational, an endeavor that transcends many modern barriers that are left over as legacies of historical forms of oppression. Within this network, we may recognize certain signifiers and locate some of the ways in which our own practices function within the ever-present structure of the rhizomatic network. If we've ever traveled from point A to point B, or ever engaged in airplane travel or boat travel, if we've ever sailed, or if we've ever surfed, then you are somewhat familiar with this network. Indeed, just as traditional seafaring functions as a network of related practices, I am introduced through the contemporary practices of surfing. As a youth growing up in Southern California, my introduction, unbeknownst to me at the time, to seafaring culture starts in the water, riding various boards, or papa as they were referred to on the Hawaiian Islands, on waves, or nalu. And so He'e Nalu, or wave sliding, the alaya, the original board of the people on the Hawaiian Islands, and the famous proa are all connected. As I begin to shape an alaya, or a board, according to ancient knowledge and under my own means in a contemporary context, I am entering in to this network and experiencing the network and learning from its knowledge base. Hey, Nalu, or waves riding, depends on a much larger life-sustaining infrastructure of oceanic seafaring and canoe building that becomes clear through practices of carving, writing, and sailing. And so, first, seafaring and surfing share not only a particular relationship with the sea, but more specifically, a way of knowing based on calculated responses to constantly changing environments. Karen Ingersoll describes this as a seascape epistemology. Both endeavors engage in unique situational contexts as frameworks for action, navigating according to a variety of signs, and directing a surfboard through water to catch and ride swells. And so there is a connection here to spatial orientation. As I shape the alaya, I don't shape the alaya to be celebrated and displayed as an artifact. I use it to experience a little bit of this seascape epistemology and to learn from it. And so this is a form of embodied knowledge. And so the alaya that I shape is now used by myself in the waters of Southern California. And so second, and perhaps most telling, is the place and space of creation shared by boards and canoes. The ancient oceanic art of carving with adze, blades, and fire is a pedagogical trade that produces these material objects, evidenced by sustained carving practices engaged in by many, including myself, and historical language texts. Notably, Hawaiian texts during the 1800s. And so as an extension of those practices, I am now engaged with others in carving canoes. And so the carving of the proa. Lastly, these elements of shared belonging are revealed in the unique practices of navigation and surfing performances, which share space as evidence in a surfing canoe from Hawaii, a canoe designed to surf, and the flying proa, which is shaped using or carved using the same techniques that you use to carve an adze, and that is also used later on to carve a surfboard. all of which are made possible by a community utterly familiar with a network of shared practice, production, and pedagogy relating to movement at sea. Now, getting to this network, I've broken this network down into a few elements. I could easily break them down into many more elements, and I encourage you to do so. I also encourage you to recognize where you might enter into this network. The way information is stored, accessed, and disseminated affect the ways in which humans are socialized and come to interact with one another. And so this is readily recognizable in the learning possessed and disseminated by the individual navigator or the palu or the master navigator. Here exemplified by Mao Piulu, who sails the Hokulea under traditional means from Hawaii to Tahiti. And so just as one builds networks of communication and activates modes of dialogue, a navigator stores, retrieves, and processes knowledge to determine spatial proportions and locations based on conceived and perceived situations. In order for one particular navigator to access such information, a much larger structure of learning must be maintained. And so, Mao Pilu, belovedly often referred to as Papa Mao, son, Antonio Pilu, is also a Palu, or master navigator, and has carried on the tradition. And so Aristotle, writing around the time distant islands were settled throughout Oceania from New Santeria, articulated such public displays as epidectic forms of rhetoric and practice. From this perspective, spectacles, rituals, and sporting events are viewed as public deliberations, which effectively communicate various societal values. Sports, for example, in the Western formation, has often held with it the values of excellence and fairness. In various community spaces, notably here on Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Hawaii, such practices continue to function in displaying the values embodied by the visible practices of canoe building, teaching, and of course, long-distance voyaging, which would not occur without the individual master navigator as the harbinger and disseminator of such knowledge. But behind the individual, of course, is the community. And so the Pialug Seafaring Academy here on Guam, led by Palu Antonio Pialug, is a community space that upholds this form of knowledge and furthers its use. The Polynesian Voyaging Society that famously sails the Hokulea initially, and since then has created other vessels and sailed the Hokulea all around the world. Initially, the Polynesian Voyaging Society builds the Hokulea and searches throughout Oceania for somebody who possesses this knowledge. And they find Mao Pialug in Satawal in Micronesia, and he transports himself to Hawaii to lead the vessel to Tahiti. Entering waters that he is unfamiliar with, he uses the ancient knowledge to successfully navigate this vessel. And so, interestingly enough, the Polynesian Voyaging Society locates a man from Micronesia to lead the efforts. And so already these leftovers of colonial divisions are being broken down, and the practice celebrates a shared space and comments on divisions that occur to this day. And so both of these organizations and these groups function based on the support of a much larger community. And I invite people to enter into these spaces via these groups and organizations through support. The next element, space. Traditional seafaring is comprised by a series of physical gestures intended to move through space deliberately. The endeavors of open sea migration that initially occur throughout Southeast Asia and notably the Pacific Ocean are miraculous human achievements and remind us of our desire as humans to explore our spatial as well as theoretical existence. And so while we often celebrate the acts that occur at sea, and a master navigator possesses a certain acumen to seascape environments, they still rely and spend most of their time on land, fostering land spaces of community involvement and physical natural interaction. Interestingly enough, there's a connection between traditional seafaring and some of the more recent feats such as outer space travel and technological advancement. Bob Finney makes the assertion that oceanic seafaring plays a precursory role to practices and perspectives that ultimately lead to space exploration. The role of the stars in seafaring reflects this connection as they provide a celestial guide for movements on Earth. And so holding up your hand in relation to celestial markers provides direction here on Earth. And so that connection between space travel and sea exploration becomes clear when we look at it from that perspective. Theorist Henri Lefebvre notes that the traces of these trajectories are performance texts written on the tablet of social, physical, and historical space. And so he makes the connection between physical space and social space. And it's debatable if physical space in its pure neutral geographical form even exists. All space is now imbued with a social tension. And so for a navigator to navigate through physical environments in today's context is also to navigate through social environments. We read these paths of the past in the daily movements of various peoples as descendants of a dialogue written on a spatial medium through gestural inscriptions. The next element, practices. Things we do. I love this word. Practices are just the things we do. And once again, we used to look at practices as just norms, just things that we needed to do to get things done in any given instance. They were just purely transactional. But now we can look at almost every practice, thanks to scholars such as Michel de Certeau, as having a communicative and a rhetorical value. The movements and gestures assumed are forms of learning and communication, which allows rhetorical processes to shift from the linguistic and the textual to the body. A communication and performance lens offers a framework that might be useful to examine a vast array of embodied forms of knowledge and writing that remain unarticulated. And so seafaring practices in the contemporary context are capable of deconstructing the symbolic structures of power that have silenced its continuation, really by its mere existence. These practices mark colonial and imperial histories while bringing attention to the ways in which these legacies are still functioning. And so the culture is capable of uniting people, places, and ways of thinking that have historically been separated. And so the next element, objects. In this context, the canoe, adze, and the alaya become a metaphor for the decimation and survival of native culture, a reminder, material reminder of historical, indigenous, colonial, and contemporary dialogue. Like the transformation of He'enalu into surfing, which becomes aligned with frameworks of leisure, competition, and consumerism, traditional seafaring undergoes a series of transformations as it is conceived and practiced today. For example, what might be seen as a specialized activity only relevant to a few practitioners is historically an important life-sustaining culture engaged in by a society. The cultural pursuits of seafaring also become a harness to serve various organizational, national, and commercial ends. And so the renowned Nusantarian, Micronesian, and Chamorro flying proa can be seen in the lobbies of multinational hotels, on signs of local restaurants, and even on the Guam flag, unwittingly used along with featuring the sail on the wrong side of the proa. And so you can see how the symbol might gain strength and be used over and over again. It might leave the territory behind, or in this case, leave the network behind as it is deployed as just a single symbolic marker. And so we must bring the language with us. And so knowledge of local environments and sustainable material use, along with community support for the material practice of traditional canoe building, ultimately propels individuals and communities across ocean mediums in acts of rhetorical displays. So the symbolic use of seafaring culture can be witnessed in numerous contexts and gain strength, even as the actual conditions for seafaring in this manner deteriorate. And so pedagogy, an entire constellation or network pertaining to the learning and the formal infrastructure of learning that takes place in traditional seafaring culture, is very interesting here and plays a large part in understanding this network. Stick charts, for example, are devices used to help navigators recognize and analyze swells from cardinal directions, as well as reflected and refracted swells from interactions with land that, of course, lead one to land. The powwow ceremony is a formal ritual of learning that doesn't take one day and is not really akin to a graduation, but it is more so a summary or an encapsulation of the entire pedagogical network and lasts oftentimes over a week. And so this is an image from a recent powwow ceremony that celebrates the status and recently took place on the island of Saipan in the Marianas. And so the star compass is one of the most useful and easily recognizable aspects of seafaring, and its ancient and contemporary form is used as a learning device of conceptualization, not a functional device used during the voyage. And so once again, we have to learn this network, and we have to learn to pay attention to different and a vast of symbolic cues in order to understand specific movements. And so it typically consists of 16 stars, yielding 32 references according to rising and setting positions. Setting a star behind you, and then aiming for a star in front of you, and staying on line. And so the ETAC system is largely conceptual as well, and acts as a frame of reference for estimating proportions of the voyage that have been sailed. It's like going to a place for the first time and not knowing where you're going and thinking, how long is this journey going to be? And then returning to that same place and really feeling comfortable and knowing exactly how long that journey is. Much in the same way, it's because you haven't broken the journey down into segments yet. Understanding that if you see one landmark, or you're halfway through, and if you see another landmark or sign, you are 3/4 of the way there. And ultimately, you turn the corner to your final destination. ETAC functions similarity. The navigator integrates and synthesizes with an ETAC system all the other observations, sensations, and perceptions. The ETAC system is a mnemonic device that is used in preparation for a voyage and in coordination with the memorized star compass. Is a theoretical way of thinking about space that fixes the navigator's canoe as stationary while envisioning islands as mobile. And so the canoe stationary while the islands move towards the canoe. And so the stars in relation to seascapes form lanes that stretch between destinations. One island is selected as a reference, and the number of star bearings over the reference island throughout a voyage determine the number of segments, or ETAC, into which the voyage is conceptually divided. Ultimately, traditional Austronesian and oceanic seafaring, as discussed here, is a shared and sustained form of indigenous knowledge and communication that transcends organizational, national, and religious divisions. And I encourage us to view it as an entire network. I also ask you and leave you with this: what other cultural practices, actions, and endeavors can be witnessed as possessing a similar communicative value? And what are some of the levels of argumentation involved? Thank you.